Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jason Antonoff with Institute for Market Transformation, and thank you for joining our call today, our semi-monthly call on Beyond Benchmarking. Lots of beeps still in the background, so I think we have a few more folks piling in here at the last minute, but I think we're at about critical mass. We've got about 20 folks on the call right now, so why don't I go ahead and get things started here. A couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, I am recording this, so just bear that in mind. I want to make it available to anybody that was not able to actually join today. I'll send out a link to the recording to everybody that had expressed an interest in being part of this. Secondly, we are probably nearing the limit of size for what's manageable in an open mic meeting as opposed to a webinar. I prefer not to go with a webinar where everybody has to chat as opposed to being able to talk openly. Use chat boxes. So everybody does have live phone lines. I'd ask you to keep your local line muted unless you're actually talking, just so we can avoid any unnecessary background noise. And we'll try to manage the conversation as best we can as we move into that part of the session. So we've got a lot of good stuff to cover today. I know we're going to have a few folks sort of joining, coming in and out of the call because of other commitments. So we may be doing a little dancing around. It might be a little exciting at times to make sure we get the right folks all involved, but we'll do our best. So let me do a quick roll call of who I've got as opposed to doing a round robin. Let me just read off the names that we have, excluding our panelists because we'll introduce them later on. But again, this is Jason Antonoff. We've got Zach Hart here in our office. Looks like we've got Alyssa Berger and Marina Kritikos. Let's see, Catherine Campbell-Orrick. Catherine, I don't think I have met you. You're with San Francisco, is that correct?
Hi, I'm with the city of Berkeley. Billy Romaine couldn't make it today, so I'm in her stead.
Okay, great. Glad you could join us. We've got Harry Bergman from DOE, Hillary Firestone from LA, Kimberly Rankin from Boulder, Ross McQuinney, New York City, Nora Wong with PNL, Megan O'Neill with City of Atlanta, Nicholas Schwartz with Denver, Terry Sullivan, City of Seattle, and Supriya Goel with PNL. Okay, somebody's got a little bit of feedback on your end, so you might have to mute your phone. And then Matt Cox with, actually not Atlanta, but with GreenLink. Is there anybody whose name I missed who's on the phone line but not on the GoToMeeting session right now, besides the panelists?
Wendy from Salt Lake.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wendy. Glad you could join. Are you still logging on to the GoToWebinar?
No, I might have to hop up, so I'm just on audio.
Okay, that's fine. No worries. All right, so let me go over quickly our agenda for the day. We're going to start with a number of fast round-robin updates. Just want to make sure we heard from some of the cities that are involved in rolling out their current policies. So in particular, Megan is going to talk about where things are with the City of Atlanta, and then hopefully Sandra Mallory will be able to join us. She's one of the parties that will be kind of coming in and out of the call, but she was going to try to give us an update on where things are with rulemaking for Seattle and their retuning ordinance. If anybody else has any updates that you'd like to share from your cities, I'd welcome you to do that at that point in the meeting. Nora is going to give us a quick update on where things are with the asset score reporting template, and then the bulk of today's call is going to be hearing from our industry experts. We've got 5 panelists that we've invited to really give us some perspective on what does it take for a regulation that is mandating requirements around audits or retrocommissioning to work. I mean, to really be effective, to give service providers enough guidance, but also leeway so they can do their job well and make sure building owners are getting good value out of it, and thus cities are seeing improvement in the building side. So that was one of the the key issues that was raised in the questionnaire we put out a few months ago. So we've invited these panelists to join us today and lend that perspective. So that is our goal for today. Any initial questions, comments, anything else you would like to add to the agenda for today? Okay. Hearing none then. Is Sandra Mallory on the line yet? Okay, let me skip ahead then, and actually let me start with Megan. And do you want to give us an update, Megan, on how things are going in Atlanta?
Sure. This is our first year of audit reporting compliance. Building owners, 10% of them each year are required to have an audit performed, meaning they have an audit performed every 10 years in total. Our audit standard is an ASHRAE level 2 audit or higher, or also the free audit provided by Georgia Power does satisfy that requirement for the time being. We have 100 buildings required to comply this year. I think I've received about 30% of the audit reports so far, and so far so good. The reporting has been a little bit complicated in terms of format. We've been accepting some spreadsheets. That was our initial template for submission, as well as using a Google form, which is what I'd prefer to use moving forward until the building asset score template is up and ready to go. So, yeah.
Megan, is that Google form shareable so we can take a look at it?
It is. It's being tweaked, but I'll share it. I'll send it to Jason in the next day or two so he can distribute.
Thanks.
Great. Any other questions for Megan? So congrats, Megan. I'm glad to hear that things are moving ahead. Maybe not quite as compliant as we'd like to see, but we're starting.
They have till the end of the year, so.
Yeah, okay. Excellent.
Mad rush time.
Of course. Okay, let me do one more check-in for Sandra Mallory. Are you on? Nope. All right. Nora, do you want to just give a quick update on where things are with the asset score template then? I can jump ahead to your slide here if you'd like.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Jason. Oh, here it is. Thank you. This is the current status of the tool development to support audit data reporting. So currently we have already deployed the beta version for general comment and testing. Here you can see the URL here. This is really like a sandbox. You can create an user account yourself, and then you let us know you want to test the reporting platform. Otherwise, you can only see the asset score portion because we want to control the user flow of the reporting platform. Just because it's not the final version yet, don't want to get folks confused. So the current form include the data fields of the current version of ASHRAE level 2. Our understanding is ASHRAE will likely go over another round of public review, also with the comments of specific field from New York City and Atlanta. We have given demo to New York City and a city of Berkeley. Any other city who's interested in working through the tool with us, and just let us know. We'll be more than happy to do that. And auditors can download individual report in a CSV file or a sample PDF report. Again, the logic behind is the CSV is to be for cities to manage the building data before a seed platform is available. The PDF report is for the auditors to share the complete report in a standard format with building owners, and then city can also take a look at individual buildings as error checking or spot check. And the last bullet is per New York's suggestion, we grouped ECMs in packages, meaning that auditors can choose if this is low cost or no cost package, and what kind of, they want to give a overall recommendation rather than just doing individual ECMs. Again, if you want to learn more of the details, you can see them in the tool. There is a sample PDF you can download from the tool interface too. We can also point you to the places if you want to learn more. Starting from January, we will move the reporting platform from the sandbox to the production version. That doesn't mean it's a production quality yet. I will still call it a beta version. But on the production version, we can save your building data. You can still save building data in the sandbox, but there is no easy way we can maintain your data and migrate into the production server. But once you use the building energy score.energy.gov, you'll be able to save your building. You can see a list of the features that we're going to roll out in quarters. The reason we're doing this, we kind of staggering the reporting platform function with the asset score function that we also need to develop for other group of users. If you have any specific requirement to meet your testing plan, just let you know. We still have some freedom to shuffle these priorities, and our guidance is really, meeting the city's needs, do our best to support your use schedule or deployment schedule. So in January, the three main features you will see is the auditor can submit the building to a city's account, and then the city can download those CSV files using the asset score. So you get a more like an admin account and be able to do multiple tasks with the data. The second is you can also download the PDF. The third is you see more data validation. In the second quarter, we'll focus on the building sync XML download, and in the last quarter, we do the building sync upload. In between, you can see we added more features specifically required by New York City. Since they are more ahead of the game compared to other cities, I believe some of the features may be beneficial to other cities too. For example, the auditors can sign the forms digitally. We provide data field definition, and sorry, it's kind of back a little bit here and there. In the second quarter, New York has this specific building lot and share system. I believe some other cities may have similar situation when buildings share the same system. You want to make sure the HVAC system are not counted twice. We also heard a suggestion from New York to include retrocommissioning inputs and measures into the reporting platform. We'll do that in our third quarter. They also want us to identify the base versus tenant space and systems. That's in our third quarter plan too. In the last quarter, we'll investigate in how we can add a geometry into the form, because the goal is once auditor enters into the data from the reporting platform, he can open that from asset score and add a little bit more information, get a model out of it. It just streamlines the whole process. The goal is to get a production version out by January 2018. We have the last 3 months in 2017 as our cushion, since our fiscal year is from October to September. So you can see we don't really have any specific things going on, but I'm sure we'll fully use the last 3 months in 2017 to polish up the tool and to make it bug-free in 2018. So this is the current development plan. We may readjust it based on the feedback from the city, but overall we're working hard and to meet all of these targets we listed here. So this is the update from me. Harry from DOE is also on the line. And Harry, do you want to speak a little bit about the pilot testing?
Yeah, sorry, about pilot testing.
Yeah,
so,
go ahead.
I think that was a great update. We're excited to see reporting platform get out in the market and really generate a lot of new data coming into the system and see its function as information conduit. And so I think we're going to have some really exciting results come from that over the next few months.
Thanks, Harry. So currently what we heard the needs is from New York City and the city of Atlanta, and Berkeley and LA are also interested in seeing and testing maybe on some of their buildings. If any other cities have similar interests and want to be the early pilot testers, and please let us know.
To just add to that, Nora's first bullet mentions, this is Supriya Goel from PNL. We have the capability to include input fields specific to a city, and our development has the structure where we can specify requirements based on cities. So for instance, in New York City, we can specify which inputs are required to meet the audit requirements, the LL87 requirements for New York City, and we can expand that to other cities if they have similar requirements. So that is what a conversation would help if that can meet your needs.
All right, thanks, Supriya. Jason, that's all from us. Go ahead.
Sure.
Hi, this
Any
is Matt
questions
Cox.
that people have?
Yes. This is Matt Cox in Atlanta with GreenLink. I had a question about the ability to make the retrocommissioning. You kind of mentioned that it was going to be potentially available to other cities that are coming along, and I think we've got several conversations I've had this week would say that there is interest in that in Atlanta, as well as having it available for both mandatory and voluntary efforts that could be moving through the Southeast. So is the anticipation that this will be made broadly available and that Atlanta might have the ability to kind of fit it to what works here more specifically? I'm just wondering about kind of the customization and the wide public availability.
I don't think New York City will have an issue with sharing that capability. Once we build into the tool, it's really a matter of you have to choose a template, like to which city this building will be reported to at the beginning, and to really add another city to the template if they're using similar structure. We already got the retrocommissioning inputs and measures from New York. If you have specific, we do want to see it sooner than later.
Okay. Yeah, Atlanta helped develop their own standard that's being used voluntarily right now, which we can definitely send over. That may help.
Okay, great.
This is Ross in New York, and I just wanted to say, yeah, I mean, it sounds like Atlanta's got their own approach going, and that's fantastic. But I don't think New York has any qualms with any city working from the retrocommissioning form that we've put together as well. So just wanted to confirm that.
Great.
All right. I have a quick question for the teams here, the cities. I think we can do it technically, but we do need to help to understand the workflow. My impression is that retrocommissioning and energy audit will likely be performed by different teams. Are we expecting, the building record entered by one person can be seen or shared by the other, or you're just try to streamline the process so one people will do both jobs? So that information is important for us to design the right workflow and tool interface.
That's a great question, or I don't know if anybody has an immediate response, but that really gets to some of the stuff we want to talk about with the industry folks as well later on today. So maybe let's just tee that up as something that is worth getting back to you on and getting some more input. I also want to emphasize to all the cities on board, it's great that New York City and Ross in particular have been taking such a lead in working with PNL and helping develop the requirements, the functional requirements. But we do want to make sure that this tool is going to be broadly useful to any number of cities with different reporting requirements and fields and things like that. So I would encourage any of you that are interested to take an early look, to get involved in taking this through the beta testing process and provide some input to NORA and SAPREA so that we make sure that what's coming out the other end is a tool that really is going to be useful for any city that wants to take advantage of this in the future. It's important that it addresses New York City needs but doesn't become a custom New York City solution. I want this to be a really good, robust, broad-based solution for all cities. So.
Yeah, and the work that SAPREA and NORA have been doing in syncing it with the kind of update or the next version of ASHRAE will hopefully, support that applicability to lots of other cities, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Great. Any other questions for Nora or anybody else regarding the asset score reporting template? Okay. I'll do another check. Sandra, are you on the line now? Sandra Mallory?
I am here.
Yay. All right. Well, glad you're able to squeeze us in for a few minutes. I know you've got a busy day. So I know that you are probably not at your computer, can't see any slides, but do you want to give us an update on where things are in Seattle? And I'll try to kind of blindly move through a few slides as you're talking, if that'll be helpful.
So, and I have the printout of the slides at least. So,
okay. And
I think, most folks have already heard many of the folks who were on the call last time have heard this, but just, as a refresh, we have put in place a mandate that all commercial buildings, non-residential buildings, 50,000 square feet or greater, need to do TuneUp every 5 years. And then we phase that in by building size. So starting with the larger buildings, their first compliance deadline is in October of 2018, and then on through. And then in addition, city facilities, we're actually required to comply by October of 2017 for the largest buildings, which is giving my RCM a little bit of heartache, but we're supposed to lead. So if you go to the next slide, Jason, the essential, we look at the tune-up as kind of a retro-commissioning light, and essentially going in, reviewing the systems, checking to see if things are working as they should be, and if they are not, fixing them. And so, for instance, looking at set points, if they're off from what they should be for occupancy, those are supposed to be corrected. And we can go to the next slide. And actually, this one is, it is essentially it's the owner who is responsible. We are going to, we know, have some issues with how that translates down to the tenant, but the ordinance, the mandate requires the owner to do this work, and then the owner in turn needs to work with their tenants to make this possible. Next slide. So where we are now is we've passed the ordinance that puts the mandate in place, and we have just completed the draft director's rule, and the rule essentially clarifies the exemptions and the extensions that are allowed under this mandate. So for instance, if you're already a high-performing building, and what we've defined that as is having an Energy Star score of 90 if you're a larger building, or 85 if you're a smaller building. So, and there's a number of those extensions and exemptions. The director's rule also identifies what a qualified tune-up specialist is. So only a qualified tune-up specialist can do this work, and it's a combination of experience and some minimum certification levels. And then the director's rule also gets much more specific about what systems and measures need to be looked at and what needs to be corrected. There are some cases where you may need to review it, but you may or may not need to update it. So for instance, there are no occupancy sensors. Well, the recommendation would be to install them, but as part of the tune-up, you're not required to. So the director's rule was just posted last week, so it's up on our website. I sent Jason a link, so you could send that around if people are interested. And then we have an open house on that next Thursday, and we'll be taking comments on it until November 30th. So we'll be getting comments back and then get those, make revisions to the director's rule, and hopefully have it final and live mid to late December. So that's where we are.
Great.
So the schedule that, is shown on a slide is, of course, pushed back a little bit.
But close. Yep. And Senator, just, you know, I did include the link to the draft rule on the slide deck now. So
okay.
There's a lot of good information there. You guys have done a nice job sort of laying out, you know, in more detail what the expectations are around specific actions to be taken. So,
and if folks have comments, we're happy. I mean, we'd love to hear them. So it's all, you know, it's new territory for all of us, I think. So happy to have your suggestions.
Great. Any questions for Sandra on where Seattle is? All right. Well, Sandra, thank you for sharing. Thank you for ducking out of your other meeting for a few minutes. And I'll thank you for that. All right. So let's move on to our main event now, which is we wanted to hear, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, from industry to see if we're really putting the ordinances together and all the associated rules in a way that is going to actually achieve desired results. So we teed up a couple of questions that we were hoping our panelists could speak to. And these, again, were based on input that we got from the questionnaires that we put up before. So the first question was, how can cities really ensure that you'll be getting high-quality work under audits and retrocommissioning requirements? It's all too easy if things aren't defined in an effective way for some service providers that perhaps aren't as interested in providing high-quality work to simply be able to check the box and advertise that, you know, we can help you comply with, you know, your city's requirements, and then the building owners end up getting results that really aren't that valuable to them and really don't help them to take appropriate action. So we want to make sure that whatever requirements are in place, it leads to high quality work on the part of service providers. You know, not that I want to imply that most service providers are going to be, you know, finding ways to wiggle around, but there is a natural interest in giving the building owners what they're willing to pay for, obviously. So that's question one that we're hoping that people can talk to a little bit. And then the second is also related, which is, you know, precisely how should these policies define the measures that should be included, and also differentiate between what should be included as part of what we all sort of generically call an audit versus what we call retrocommissioning or retuning. And, you know, things like ASHRAE Standard 211 are going to help clarify these definitions a little bit, but there is still some ambiguity in what is really included within the scope of each of these sort of processes. There's some industry, loosely defined industry standards, but not anything that is firm enough that regulatory language could actually refer to it. So, you know, what would the industry like to see on the part of cities, or what do they recommend that we refer to as far as other standards, like that, so that there is a little bit more guidance, more assurance that when we're expecting somebody to perform an audit, we know what's going to come out the other end. So those are the two main questions. I'm sure we're going to dive into lots of other stuff related to those. Let me go ahead and very quickly introduce our panelists. So we have 5 different speakers who are all involved with regional or national service providers. I think you're all involved in doing at least audits and audits plus retrocommissioning at some level. And the reason that I reached out to many of these folks is that they're involved working with many of the cities, many of you who are on the call, many other cities who actually have programs in place. So Jim, for example, Jim Kelsey, who's president of KW Engineering, is from the Bay Area, San Francisco, so very involved in the work that's been going on there, as well as working more nationally, and has been leading the ASHRAE 211P process. I know many of you have heard and speak in previous calls, so he's got some good perspective on what's happening on the regulatory side as well as on the practitioner side of things. Joshua Case is Director of Code Green Solutions out of New York City, so obviously very involved in the work that's been going on in New York City. Code Green has other offices around the country, so they've been involved in places like California as well, and many of the other markets that have requirements in place. Derek James is Director of NORESCO, another national service provider, so involved with many of the cities that have retrocommissioning and audit requirements in place. And Derek was also involved in a task force, a stakeholder group meeting in Denver, because Denver is in the process right now of putting some rules together for potential legislation that they're considering around benchmarking and related energy efficiency programs. John Heller, in a similar role, is president of Ecotope out of Seattle, and they were the technical advisors to City of Seattle in developing the rulemaking there. So he's been intimately involved in that entire process of thinking through and helping guide the city into how they should craft rules in a way that would make sense. And then finally, Barry Abramson is principal with Servidyne out of Atlanta. Servidyne has been very active in the Atlanta market as well as in New York and other East Coast cities, and has been an industry expert in speaking on these issues. So I think we've got a really great group of folks here that all, again, have hands-on experience and have also been involved in at least some degree with the regulatory process that cities are looking at. So I'm really hoping they can speak to, from their perspective, how we should bridge that gap, how we make sure, again, that these regs are crafted in a way that actually makes sense for the industry and that will achieve our desired results. So we've got a couple of folks actually have some slide decks that we'll go through, and we'll just go through in the order I have people listed here on this this introductory slide. So Jim, why don't I hand it off to you? I'll go ahead and drive the slides, but let's take 5 or 6 minutes and go through any, just to refresh everybody's memory, we're going to do some opening comments, 5 or 6 minutes for each of the panelists. I'm going to hold off on questions until we're done with all of these initial presentations, and then we'll have half an hour at the end for an open Q&A. So Jim?
All right, thanks, Jason. Yeah, so this might be review and a little just sort of kind of groundwork of where we are in the energy audit industry, and so I'll take it fairly quickly. But yeah, I've been talking for about the last year about the Wild West of energy audits, because it really has been that. It's been a very unregulated field. You can go to the next slide. The the barriers to entry for calling yourself an energy auditor are very low. Basically, anybody with a camera and a clipboard can call themselves an energy auditor. The tools are cheap. There's been a lack of consistent methods, and both for reporting and performing work. And we all know that it's incredibly important in buildings when you're making changes to how they operate to maintain safety and comfort and reliability of those systems. And so I've said that audits are like photography. It's everybody says that they can do it, but the difference between what is done by professionals and what is done by amateurs can look very different. Move on to the next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the kind of energy audit schema that ASHRAE has developed, I always remind people that it's intended that the energy audit levels build upon one another, and then you have benchmarking as sort of your base level activity, then a level 1 as kind of a walkthrough or scoping audit, level 2 builds upon that, and then level 3 is really moving from identifying site-specific measures to really developing projects that are ready to build with lower risk. Next slide, please. What they are not is kind of 3 versions of the same thing. The audit levels are actually very, very distinct. And next slide, please. And they're also not like 3 it's not a continuously adjustable scale, although people often treat it that way. There is no, ASHRAE level 1.5, which is, midpoint between a 1 and a 2. What we find is that when people ask for that, they usually want the results of a level 2 audit, and they want to pay for a level 1 audit. So that's sort of our industry experience. Next slide, please. So to address some of these issues, we started several years ago working on ASHRAE Standard 211, which is now in its second draft form and was just out for public review. And the whole point of 211 is to set a minimum bar, and really our objectives were to answer the questions that Jason put before you all, or before us all, about how to maintain a level of practice that is credible. Next slide, please. One of the issues, so where we are with that standard is that we just closed our public review period. We got, I think, about 600 or so comments that we're currently doing triage on and making edits to the standard in response to those comments. Sorry, it's more like 300 in this round. We got 600 in the first round. If we make substantive changes to the standard, we may have to go out for an additional public review to review those changes, and we are targeting sort of making that decision in January, whether or not we need to go out for another substantive review, and we are targeting publication in the spring. So that's the goal that we've set. Next slide. Some of the things that we are trying to address in the standard are a kind of a threshold for what are reasonable energy savings calculations. For instance, that you use the same analysis approach for your proposed case energy efficiency measure as you do the base case. To the extent that that's possible, what we want people doing is is not creating savings through the analytical method. We want auditors to be clear about what changes they're making in their analysis between base case and proposed, that they're taking interactions among multiple measures into account, that we not have any kind of black box energy savings or simple energy savings fractions associated with analysis of energy efficiency measures, and that folks are clear about their simulation inputs. Next slide, please.
And Jim, we should probably wrap this up the next minute or two here if we can.
All right, let's skip the next one then, and I do want to go to the QC table. One of the things that I think is the most important that we've added in the standard this round is the requirement of a quality control table, so that we make it clear how your energy savings estimates compare to historical bills. That's just a basic, fundamental level of quality control. Next slide, please. One thing that we have seen in the market is a great diversity among all of your cities in terms of the level of qualifications required of energy auditors, and so we have written that into the standard as well. Next slide, please. And this is our working definition for qualifications of an energy auditor, and I'll say briefly that this has kind of been the most contentious area of the standard, but it's also the part that I believe energy auditors feel like is very important part of the standard, is to set a minimum threshold for the qualifications of energy auditor. And so the rest of the deck is points that we can get to if we have time for later, but I'll leave it at that. Qualifications, if you want to wrap it up.
Great, thanks, Jim. So yeah, nice overview, and it's great that there's a lot of work going on with 211. That's going to address obviously one of the big needs we have right now, just to have a standard in place. So really appreciate all the work you're doing to drive that process. So let's go ahead and move ahead to our next speaker. So Joshua Case with Code Green Solutions.
Yep.
So Joshua, all yours.
Great. And thank you, Jim. Definitely I am the choir that you're preaching to on that front with a lot of the things you guys are working on. I believe you're working with my Associate Director of Engineering, Ben O'Donnell, on the 211P energy audit standard. So good to hear your voice and good to hear you're fighting for the good cause here. To give you guys a quick overview, I don't have any slides prepared for this. I'll definitely be brief, but I do want to give you guys a little background. Code Green Solutions is a sustainability and energy management provider in New York City. We've been there since the beginning of Local Law 87, and we're also one of the biggest providers of Local Law 84 benchmarking services for commercial buildings in the city. Commercial buildings are our focus. We work primarily with commercial real estate. We've done 250 million square feet of energy studies and primarily larger buildings. So 50,000 square feet, definitely on the small end of what we deal with. But it's definitely been an interesting process from the get-go with New York City in pioneering this type of effort. You know, the first thing to say is, and I'm sure it's been said many times, but kudos to New York City for being the pioneers on this front, for throwing something out there and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And hopefully other cities can learn from that as we continue to go through the process here. We also have an office out in California where we do commissioning and energy audit work out there as well. So excited to hear about all the work happening, Berkeley, LA, and many other locations, San Francisco included. Just a few points to get to the two questions that sort of are the prompt in this panel. You know, I have a few bullet points that I scrabbled together with regards to issues that you run into trying to roll out a program like this. One of them, with regards to quality, is enforcement of energy audits. I think fear is a factor here. So, you know, when we were involved with Local Law 87 audits back in 2013, because there was a lot of unknowns and uncertainty associated with it, I think that the average property manager and client trying to figure out where to go one way or the other was willing to buy in more to a robust and high quality energy audit process. Unfortunately, I think what comes along with that are fly-by-night shops that are looking to attack things from two different directions. So you have, you know, I remember seeing Google AdWords alerts back in 2013 for Local Law 87 compliance for free. It was something that, you know, compared to the work that we were doing in buildings, a complete understatement for the scope that is associated with any energy audit or retrocommissioning effort at a building. That was something that, you know, didn't really affect our clientele specifically. You know, we typically work with property managers that are already have buy-in in terms of sustainability, but especially for property managers that may not be, you know, the Class A office buildings, drawing the distinction and having the appropriate enforcement in place to prevent these fly-by-night shops that are either as I mentioned, offering free or incredibly low-cost audits where no equipment is really tested during specific periods where it needs to be tested, and you also have shops out there that are charging a lot and not delivering on that, and just taking a healthier margin on the work that they do. You know, the New York City DOB is a very limited entity when it comes to what they're able to do on the enforcement side. They're doing the best that they can. And in reviews that we've had done with the DOB, they've done a great job of, you know, dissecting the components of our energy audit work, our retrocommissioning work, and delivering on, you know, feedback that's appropriate, substantive, and things that we can build on. But when you only have a few people working on it and you're trying to implement this across New York City of all places, enforcement is clearly a key issue. I think some of the QC guidance that Jim mentioned earlier is definitely a big part of that as well. Another thing that I just wanted to bring up, especially for cities getting started on this, is tenant-related concerns. It's something that can easily be underestimated, especially Class C, Class B office buildings. There are a lot of tenants who are completely open with this type of information if they have direct utility meter accounts and things like that. But you also have tenants in buildings that are incredibly sensitive about the information associated in their utility bills. Access to their spaces is a very difficult thing to do unless you're planning for that ahead of time. So it's something, lease language is a great way to try and to tackle it if you can do it up front. But unfortunately, a lot of these leases are in place already, and they've been in place for a long time and will be in place for a long time. You can look at New York City's Local Law 88, which will be rolled out or is currently active and due by 2025 as a first sort of pioneering effort on that front to target tenant spaces specifically. The last point I would make related to utility data, definitely critical to get buy-in of the utilities associated with a given area. This is clearly a big concern on the benchmarking side, but especially when you're gathering asset score level information, when you're doing an energy end use breakdown, having clear guidance as to what is tenant related loads and energy usage versus what is base building, and what are the main systems that are really providing the meat of the conditioning within the spaces is really critical information to gather up front. Otherwise, on the back end, you're going to have a very difficult time trying to benchmark these buildings and understanding which are the really good performing buildings versus the buildings that are lacking and have a lot of low-hanging fruit opportunities. I think that covers my bullet points. Really appreciate you guys having me on, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Joshua. That's very helpful. All right, let's go back west. And Derek, do you want to talk for a little bit about what you've been seeing in Denver and how that could apply to future regs?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks, guys, for the groundwork there, and I'll come at it from maybe a little bit different angle in that looking at it from a policy making standpoint for those cities that are contemplating writing policy around benchmarking, energy efficiency, auditing, retrocommissioning, is the challenge, as everyone knows, is trying to strike the right balance in a policy for all the stakeholders that are going to be affected by that policy. So for this discussion, maybe looking at it from three main stakeholder groups of service providers being one, building owners that would be affected by the regulation, and then policymakers themselves from an administrative standpoint, and ensuring that the policy is going to achieve what is desired and what's set out to do, and finding that balance so it does meet those goals. And then from just a public policy cost-benefit standpoint of how much burden are you willing to put on the building owners to ensure that you meet your targets and your goals. And then from the service provider standpoint is providing enough direction to the service providers, but also allowing enough professional liberty for those service providers to achieve the desired outcome as well for the building owners. So it's really trying to strike that right balance of you can draw or start with a blank canvas and allow the market kind of decide on what that balance is from the standpoint of allowing the service providers do what they do on a daily basis outside of any policy. Or you can take it a more prescriptive approach where you're really more defining where those lines are drawn and allowing or providing or requiring the service providers to stay within those lines. Selfishly, from a service provider standpoint, being on the fully prescriptive end of things, service providers want to have that professional liberty enough to be able to provide the benefit of how they approach these types of projects. So it's, to me, I think it's probably somewhere in the middle where it's going to strike the balance of the burden on the building owner. May not be as much from a public policy standpoint. One thing to think about is if you have a blank canvas, there's probably going to be more administrative burden and cost to manage the process and the rules, whereas maybe a more prescriptive approach, you don't need as much maybe administrative oversight. I mean, maybe there's a balance within that. But I guess talking a little bit more specifically about ensuring quality, a lot of cities are looking at just at the very beginning how you qualify providers up front, setting certain credential requirements, experience levels is really the beginning of ensuring quality. And then from there, going into actual, the balance that I was talking about, prescriptive versus open-ended, is maybe looking at, for example, on retrocommissioning activities in the rules or the regs themselves. You can define what the base required activities are for a retrocommissioning study to be done for certain size buildings. For example, in the city of Boulder, there's a table that was written in the city manager rules where buildings under 50,000 square feet is more of a building tune-up, and it has a list of activities required for a building tune-up. For larger buildings that are required to do full retrocommissioning, there's a list of activities required for the full-blown retrocommissioning. And then as far as the report requirements, kind of prescribing what is required from a content standpoint in the report, but allowing some flexibility for the service providers to meet the level of detail within each respective content area. So it's, again, kind of finding that balance on where you want to fall. But from a policymaking standpoint, it's one thing to really think about as you're approaching it is how much are you willing to accept on managing and administrating the program and finding and choosing the lane that you want to go down and the ramifications of that lane based on how much burden you're willing to accept from a management standpoint. The other thing to think about too is outside of kind of rules and regs is thinking about providing some help desk type of support, providing program guidelines, help desk type of tools and templates that can be used for the stakeholder groups, both from an owner's perspective, building owner's perspective, and a service provider's perspective. For example, if service provider or rather building owners are looking to hire a service provider, what should they be looking at from a quality standpoint, and providing guidance tools around that as well. So those are kind of the thoughts that I had coming into this, and looking forward to some follow-up questions around these ideas.
Thank you, Derek. All right, John, we'll move over to you. I'm anxious to get into the Q&A session here. I'm biting my tongue as well. But John, why don't you give us a few of your initial insights on what you think would make the most sense from a regulatory perspective?
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
You're fine.
Okay, so again, I'm John Heller from Ecotope in Seattle. I was provided technical assistance to the City of Seattle in the development of the TuneUp initiative here. So these are my opinions, not necessarily the City of Seattle's opinions. I think a few things here. One is to be really clear about what the goal of the program is. Presumably it's about carbon reductions and efficiently operating buildings. So I think it's important to shift the focus from thinking about trying to get people to do specific things to shifting the focus to what is the energy use of the building, what's the EUI, and how much did we reduce the EUI through this program. The TuneUp program is not an end in itself. It really needs to be considered as part of an overall strategy for reducing carbon emissions and energy use across the commercial sector. So hopefully that's where these tune-up programs are coming from and being looked as one of the first steps into a series of programs that are going to be rolled out to reduce carbon emissions across the city. And since these tune-up ordinances seem to be one of the first things that are rolling out, I think it's really important for them to be successful. And to be successful, they need to yield some measurable results, and they need to not be too onerous. They need to not create kind of a backlash against these types of mandatory programs targeting carbon reductions. And I think there's some danger in that. So the way that in Seattle we've kind of focused the ordinance is to mandate things that are really focused on fixing control problems, operational problems that are leading to energy inefficiencies, maintenance issues, really the no-cost and very low-cost measures, and then to recommend more capital measures. So there will be mandatory research and recommendations made for cost-effective capital measures, but it'll not necessarily be mandated that the building owner follow up on those. So that's kind of how we're trying to balance what's mandated and what's not, and keeping people interested in and happy about participating. Wherever possible, these should really dovetail with existing utility programs, and I really applaud the work that's being done on the ASHRAE audit standard 211. I think all of these programs should be aligning with that standard, and if we can get that standard used across the industry, it enables so much better sharing of data, comparison of before and after, comparison of different cities and different regions, because we'll all be using the same data points and the same names for all the data points. That kind of standardization is really really important for this as we roll these kind of things out. In my opinion, the data collection aspect of these tune-up programs is one of the most important aspects. We need to take the opportunity of these tune-ups and audit programs, take the opportunity of sending skilled auditors into these buildings to begin to build a database of the buildings in the city. What are the buildings? How big are the buildings? How old are the buildings? How much energy do they use? Get the EUIs, and what are the basic system characteristics? What kind of HVAC systems do they have? What kind of lighting systems do they have? And how old are they? How close to needing to be replaced are they? This type of data allows for future planning regarding how to get deeper savings into these buildings than just the 5, 10, 15% that we're expecting from these tune-up ordinances. And it also allows then to figure out what buildings and systems need to be targeted as part of a comprehensive carbon reduction initiative, and hopefully some indication about the schedule for those needs. So seeing what systems are out there that are having big impacts on energy use and how old they are and when they might need to be replaced, then we can start to develop strategies for replacing those systems. So to wrap up, ideally what we get out of a TuneUp ordinance is we're collecting the data that we need to assist in future planning for deeper reductions. We are fixing the basic controls problems that exist in most commercial buildings out there and just getting 5, 10, 15% savings out of those buildings immediately just by making them run better. We're identifying the cost-effective energy conservation measures for the building owners and hooking them up with existing utility programs to help pay for those immediately cost-effective energy conservation measures, which hopefully they'll follow up on. And then finally, we're identifying the long-term measures that need to happen to get deep energy savings out of those buildings and beginning to set up a plan for those buildings for future significant system upgrades. So notifying the building owner, look, you've got a VAV system that's 20 years old, you're going to have to deal with this in the next 5 years. These are the systems that you should be considering rather than just replacing it with another VAV system. Here's what you should be doing, and beginning that long-term planning for deep energy retrofits. And those are my comments. Thanks for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Let's move on to Barry and wrap up our opening sessions here. Barry, I know you had a couple of slides as well, so let me pop those up on the screen. And
okay. Sure. So, yeah, thanks. So my perspective is coming primarily from being a practitioner, doing this stuff for the last 30-plus years around the country. Also serving on the ASHRAE committee for the last couple of years under Jim Kelsey's great leadership and along with Supriya. And I'm also on the lead technical advisory group for energy and atmosphere. So that's sort of my experience base. And before I just hit a few quick bullets, since no one's done it yet, I am going to invoke the elections here because I actually think there's a couple lessons from the election that bear on our conversation. One is, and with due respect to the previous comments about the importance of data, I think that just relying on data is not necessarily a good predictor of the outcome. And the other lesson, I think, is that buildings, just like voters, have a lot of idiosyncrasies, and the more you delve into those idiosyncrasies, the more you find out, and sometimes the more disturbing the results can be. So with that, I wanted to just, again, I guess go back to some of the fundamental points and then sort of lead into the discussion. But I wanted to start with, okay, what is a good energy audit? What are the critical elements that make an energy audit good? And when I was thinking about this, I thought there's basically 4 elements here. One is getting an understanding of what is actually going on in the building. Where is energy being used? Where is it being wasted? What are the requirements that the energy has to meet for that building to function? The second is, based on that understanding, coming up with solutions that are both viable and sustainable. And that's not just a technical task. It's also looking at who's running the building, who owns the building, what are they capable of implementing, what are they capable of maintaining in the future, those kinds of things. So the solutions actually have to be more than technical. They have to be appropriate for all kinds of factors to make them implementable. Third is reasonable accuracy in the economic analysis. No energy audit is going to be plus or minus 1%. If we get 10%, even with energy modeling, we're doing quite well. But you don't want numbers that are just crazy. So there does need to be some level of reasonableness in terms of the analysis, the tools that are used, and a reliance on the results for both costs and savings. And then lastly, there has to be a vehicle, an ability, and a mechanism to communicate the results of the audit to the lay people that are receiving it, the decision makers, because without that piece, nothing's actually going to happen. You can go to the next slide. So given that those are the criteria that I see are important for a good audit, then the question is, what are the best predictors of actually getting a good energy audit at the end of the process? And I think several people already mentioned this. The first point, I think, is first and foremost, experience and competence of the energy auditor is the single most critical factor. Way above and beyond having the right forms to fill out, or any particular scope of work that's delineated, or anything like that. And I think, as Jim Kelsey mentioned, this has been one of the most contentious issues kicked around in the ASHRAE committee about how do we define the term qualified energy auditor. And so that's worthy of quite a bit of thought and consideration. Secondly, even if you have an experienced energy auditor or audit team, if you don't have the appropriate scope and resources, then that auditor is not going to be able to do a thorough job. And that doesn't necessarily mean a big scope and a lot of resources. In some cases, if they're simple buildings or small buildings, you can overdo an energy audit and make it more complicated than it needs to be. So having the right scope and being able to provide the right amount of time and energy into the process, along with having the qualified person or people doing it, to me are the two main factors here. So quickly, just the last slide, to hit the second question that was posed to us, what are the things that should be covered or that go into building tune-ups and retrocommissioning? With this, I think a number of cities and some of the discussions been mentioned that there's been delineation between different types of buildings, different sizes of buildings in terms of a simple tune-up versus a more complicated and involved retrocommissioning investigation. But in stepping back and looking at, okay, what is it that we're looking for? I think it's the same no matter what kind of building or what size, although the regulations will have to delineate, what level of investigation is appropriate to figure out what's going on. And what we generally look for comes down to operating schedules, overcooling, overheating, simultaneous heating and cooling, overblowing, overpumping with fans and pumps, overlighting, meaning occupancy sensors that aren't working, or lighting controls or dimming controls that aren't working, outside air, which could mean too much and having to condition it when it's not appropriate, or having too little, like not using outside air when you could in economizer mode, things like that. And then leaks, which could be anything from steam traps to air blowing the wrong place, or water going in the wrong place or spilling over something, or something like that. And these things can be differently applied depending on climate and particular things going on in regions, but generally this is what we find are the tasks that we have is to figure out what's going on related to these 6 things. So I'll stop it there and hand it back off.
Perfect. Thank you, Barry. So now we can dive into our discussion. I'm going to take executive prerogative here and start off with one question, which is a number of you have talked about, this fine balance of how to have enough latitude. The service provider can actually use professional judgment and find the right stuff to do. But if you prescribe things, then it tends to be a more straightforward process, although you may not achieve the results. What's not clear to me is if you don't prescribe things, what is the bar that you're accountable for? John, you had talked a lot about, the real goal is just to save energy. So I guess one option is we could say, anytime you do retrocommissioning, you have to demonstrate that you saved at least 10% energy in the building. Seems like a heavy-handed way to approach it, but I'm curious to hear from maybe a couple of you on what is the real alternative to prescribing everything in great detail then? What can you then gauge somebody's performance against to ensure they actually did an appropriate level of work and intervention there?
Sure, I'll take this. This is Derek with Noresco. The City of Denver approached it from the standpoint of looking at it both from a performance-based path and a prescriptive path. So allowing this performance-based path does that very thing of if you achieve 15% energy savings over a given baseline, you don't have to do anything else. So you've given them the opportunity to figure out how to reduce their energy in the building without prescribing anything. As long as they can verify that those savings have been achieved over that prescribed baseline, nothing else is left to do. But if you don't, you go into this prescriptive path and you have to go down the energy audit retrocommissioning path, which then you begin to define what that is and what you need to do in order to comply with the rules, but also achieve the savings that are set out to achieve.
Yeah, this is John Heller. The City of Seattle did something very similar. That there's a list of exemptions, buildings that are exempt from having to comply, and one of those exemptions is show with billing data that you've done something to save a minimum of 15% energy over the last couple of years. So it's a very similar having a performance thing. And in terms of the prescriptive program, there has been ample use of the term as appropriate, which makes all of the prescriptive requirements very squishy, because it says make sure that the schedules for the HVAC equipment match the actual operating schedules of the building as appropriate, because there are times when you don't want it to exactly match the operating schedule of the building for various reasons, and that's where you have to rely on the fact that you've qualified the TuneUp specialists and that they actually know what it is that they're doing. So yes, Seattle has a list of prescriptive requirements, but it's been qualified and left to the up to the experience of the contractor to figure that out.
Okay, great.
This is Jim. I'd like to add on to that thought, and I appreciate Derek for bringing the idea of education into it, because I think if you go down the prescriptive path, if part of that path is retrocommissioning or audits, you still have the question of like, well, how deep do you go? And I think one of the assumptions that is out in the marketplace is an assumption of kind of linear value, that okay, if I go out and get my energy audit, I may get 2 bids. If one of them costs twice as much as the other one, am I going to get half as much value from the one that costs half as much? And I think my feeling and the feeling that I've heard from folks on our committee is that there's a threshold below which you get no value. And so if we see this downward pressure on costs, that means that some building owners go to providers that have very kind of quick approaches. The potential for impact goes from something to nothing. And I think that there's an education component there that cities could help with, in terms of letting owners know that the lowest quality provider is not necessarily going to provide the best service, and even that the energy audit measures that they want to pursue, it's not necessary. There's another sort of fundamental assumption there that folks want to pursue the measures that are the most cost effective, that have the highest return, and that's also not true. I mean, we see building owners making decisions for a lot of reasons that go beyond economics of the measure.
That's great. That's really helpful. So it's kind of to recap what I'm hearing, though, is going back to this whole performance concept, it really is giving building owners a chance to voluntarily work with a retro-commissioning agent, have an audit, make capital improvements, whatever they want to do to improve their building and hit the performance standard. And if not, if they haven't hit those threshold targets, then when a retro-commissioning agent, let's say, has to come in and perform because you fell short, that's when they would have to actually meet the prescriptive requirements. So a retro-commissioning agent could, in effect, be given wide latitude or be held to tighter levels of accountability based on whether they're doing it kind of before or after that assessment is made on, or have you hit a performance target already?
So this is Ross in New York. I'm curious to know if anybody knows how often that performance standard approach is followed rather than the prescriptive path.
Well, it hasn't started yet in Seattle, so there's no data here.
The other one was in Denver, is that right?
Yeah, Denver, it's not in effect yet.
Got it.
And I haven't seen any other cities that have a performance path.
In New York, we don't. It's not quite EUI measurement. It's if you meet some other requirements like Energy Star certification over a period of time. So it's not exactly the same thing. But I just know that those options have almost never been utilized here in the city. But again, it's not quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are, this is Jason, we are working with a number of other cities that are at least considering this, like LA. I don't know if you're still on the line, Hillary, but
yep.
That's sort of what everybody is looking at, but you're absolutely right, no one has really done it yet, so there isn't any test data to look at and see how widely adopted it's going to be.
I think the big question in LA, because our proposal is you can prove that you've done a 15% energy reduction and a 20% water reduction, is concerns over the time frame they're allowed to use and proof that they've achieved those savings.
Ron, this is Cliff. Backing up to your comment, do you have any idea why so few people are using the Energy Star exemption in New York City?
I don't really have an idea why. I just know that having talked to Holly at Department of Buildings, she said that she's never seen it.
I guess, this is Barry, I guess one question on the performance versus prescriptive is, with the performance side, is the goal to actually drive performance or provide an exemption for performance?
It's to drive performance. So yeah. At Denver, so there's an exemption path, so there's some off-ramps where you don't have to do anything. If you're a LEED building already, for example, you don't have to do anything else. But if you're not in any of those off ramps, then you have the choice of doing the performance path or the prescriptive path.
Yeah, I think in Seattle it's a little bit of both. One is one of the exemptions or off ramps is to have participated in a utility retrocommissioning program. So buildings that get themselves organized in time and get signed up for one of those programs before they're required to meet the ordinance won't have to meet the ordinance. So part of the idea there is to drive people to that program. Similarly, whether they do that program or not, trying to drive people to do their own, take initiative and do their own improvements on their building. If they can show that they've gotten 15% reductions through their bill stream, then again they're exempt. So the intent is to try to drive people to do that on their own through one of these other mechanisms, and then also at the same time for high-performing buildings that already have a low Energy Star score or high Energy Star score, that they don't have to go through the motions.
The other thing I'll throw out in the conversation too is allowing the flexibility within a particular policy is also important because of the ramifications of free ridership from a utility standpoint. And what I mean by that is if you have a purely strict mandate that requires building owners to do X, Y, and Z, the utility programs, if you have incentive programs, see that as being potentially free ridership, and you would not be allowed to participate in their incentive programs.
I have a question, if I could pop in for a second.
Sure. You're a little bit faint. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Jim, you had mentioned that there's a threshold at which the owners would not receive a benefit for the work that they're commissioning, and that your group had kind of come to that position. What thresholds did you all agree existed, and what kind of red flags should we be looking for?
Well, thanks. That's a good question, and I tried to get to that a little bit in the slides that I put together. I think Barry was one of the folks that was behind bringing this into the standard, but I think the quality control check of at least comparing your energy savings to historical bills is an important one, to make sure that, you know, just sort of the fundamental level of, you know, my lighting measure savings are going to be a reasonable fraction of my base load energy use and lighting. I think that's just kind of a fundamental one to make. You know, other kind of elements that we've tried to include in the standard are, you know, a level of depth of the investigation that somebody looks at all of the end uses that contribute significantly to the base case energy use in a facility. So if lighting is 40% of your energy use and you don't have any lighting measures, then, you know, that should be highlighted, that you know, that connection should be easy to make from the material that you're reporting in your audit. So yeah, those are kind of some of the fundamental ones. But I agree with Barry's slides too, that you know, one of the greatest predictors there is the qualifications of the auditor, and that is, you know, one element that has been the hardest to nail down.
Well, let me ask one question about scoping. John, I think it's interesting that in Seattle, there's a lot of detail that's gone into the requirements for tenant spaces, whereas what we've seen in most other areas is that these sorts of programs really, for better or for worse, only apply to base systems, common area systems where the building owner has control. So I'm curious, maybe some folks other than John, if you could speak to the practical realities of performing audits or doing retrocommissioning that encompass everything within the building, including both owner-occupied and tenant-occupied spaces.
This is Josh with Code Green. I can speak a little to this. In New York City, it is a constant problem, both in, you know, LEED certifications that we go for with buildings and for local law 87 compliance. And it's also an issue when you're looking at the data afterwards. If there are a lot of buildings we work with where tenants have their own HVAC systems, if you're trying to benchmark those end uses and you have no access to those systems, it makes it very difficult to do an ASHRAE level 2 end use breakdown that's appropriate and apples to apples between the buildings. You know, better data collection up front, you can try and normalize for that, but I think it is something that is consistently an issue because of the wide spectrum of tenant relationships with their landlords. You know, there's something to be said for having a program that focuses specifically on base building systems, and then a separate program that focuses on tenant level systems. The thing that I think New York is doing well in terms of that breakdown is providing a lot more lead time on tenant related systems. So, you know, local law 88, the way that it is currently set up, the reason why requirements aren't really due until 2025 is you do have a lot between 2013 and 2025, a lot of lease turnover that's going to happen over that period. And when you're negotiating leases with your tenants is really the absolute best time to have that conversation with them about, is your space properly submetered? What sort of equipment do you have within your space? What are the accessibility guidelines that are going to govern the next 10, 15 years of performance? So yeah, it's definitely something you want to take a very nuanced approach with, and lead time is critical.
I think this is one thing that's very location specific. New York, Boston, Chicago, where a lot of the tenants are direct metered, it's very difficult. Los Angeles, Atlanta, it's not a big deal because generally there's just master metering, and there's not that much of a distinction.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think you also have more of an issue with existing building stock. So a building that's 60 years old and tenants have turned over many, many times, spaces have shifted in terms of their size. A lot of the stuff we're able to get, even in master metered buildings, can be within. I think that is more of a down the road issue in terms of trying to get accuracy there, but it's something we should keep in mind on the horizon.
One of the interesting things on the policy front that's happened in California in the last year is that AB 802 actually makes it the responsibility of the utility to aggregate energy use consumption within buildings for benchmarking purposes. So they have basically given the utilities a deadline, I believe it's beginning of next year, where for facilities that are not master metered, but the building is intended to be benchmarked on a whole building basis, that the utility needs to provide that data kind of as a set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great, and it's something New York City does as well. Con Edison, mixed success in terms of getting that data in a timely fashion sometimes, but I also understand their strengths and restrictions there.
But there's two issues to this. One is getting the data, for benchmarking purposes. The other is making things happen in the tenant space. And so even, let's say in New York, where you can maybe get aggregated data, if the landlord doesn't touch the lighting in the tenant space, then you can't really do an effective, lighting audit that's going to make anything happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, great. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, and I do want to respect everybody's time. So I want to give a big, big thank you to all of our panelists today. Really appreciated hearing your perspectives on this. It's incredibly important that we understand there's the perspective of industry as we're trying to put these policies together. So thank you all so much for participating in this. And to everybody else that was able to join today as well, big thank you. I will be sending out the link to the recording as well as the PowerPoint and some notes that we've taken from this. And we've got our next call scheduled for 2 months ahead into a fresh new year with a new political landscape. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the week, and we will be in contact with you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for hosting us, Jason.
Thanks.
Bye.